In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the 1970s. It's a curious decade, a difficult decade, and really difficult for me for a number of reasons. One, it's one of the first decades that I remember, that I have any personal recollection of. And so here I can actually enter the realm of memory on an individual and direct basis. But it's also difficult because there's a tendency, one that I've certainly been guilty of sort of overlooking the 1970s. And I think wanting to move between the 60s with all that happened with civil rights and Lyndon Johnson and Vietnam, to move across the 1970s and sort of skip over to the 1980s and the so-called Reagan Revolution. There's a tendency sometimes, especially when you're framing things in terms of presidential administrations as categories for American or periodizations of American history, a tendency perhaps to want to move over the less interesting presidents and toward the ones that stand out. So that makes the 70s perhaps a little difficult. But I think another thing that makes the 70s difficult, or has in the past for me, is really trying to figure out what the 70s were all about. And I think one of the things I've come to is the 70s is really a period of what you might call juxtapositions, of conflict. Maybe it's fine from a historical standpoint that there's not a clearly apparent theme that you can sort of settle everything on. Maybe the theme for the 1970s is really one where the conflicts we saw emerging in the 1960s begin to take a more concrete shape and actually evolve slightly into a form that would shape the U.S. and its history really through the 1980s and 1990s into the 21st century. And if you look at the 70s that way, it I think, opens the door for a particular understanding of the 1970s, but also of American culture in the latter 20th century. And that makes the 70s pretty important in sort of the same way I think of the 1920s, the Jazz Age, is important. I mean, you could argue, well, not much happened during the Jazz Age, right? We're not talking about the Depression, and we're not talking about the New Deal, and World War I's over, so, what happens in the 20s? You could say not much. But that's only if you're thinking in terms of events. And increasingly, I think American historians are thinking in terms of ideas, thinking about periodizing in terms of ideas. That being said then, the question would be, what are the major conflicts? What are the core issues around which the 1970s swirls? And I've got some general things that I want to mention here. And part of this, too, is me trying to understand. That's always the case with these lectures, right? It's not me making pronouncements, this is how it was. It's more about me thinking to myself, well, how do we best understand these periods in American history? I think one thing to start, we see in the 1970s the sort of push for freedom, the push for access to rights that we saw emerging in the 1960s through the civil rights movement, broadly defined. We see that continuing into the 1970s. So there we go. I mean, there's a place to start. But I also think by the 1970s, there is a certain pullback, a certain, what's the right word here? There's a certain disenchantment, if you will, with perhaps some of the idealism, with the time it's taken, with the effort, maybe a drawback in a way, and a sort of dark side that emerges alongside these new expressions of freedom in the United States. So that's number one. With freedom, there's also great vulnerability. Secondly, I think you see the 1970s, or I see the 1970s, as sort of an era that expresses both the power of the United States as a major global superpower, but also in some ways the powerlessness of the United States. And all I mean by that is in no way to denigrate the U.S. here, but the point is simply that it's one of those sort of freaks of history that oftentimes the most powerful nations will find themselves unable to confront what ought to be sort of, or ignoring what are seemingly unimportant issues, unimportant matters that ought to be no threat whatsoever, and yet turn out to be a major threat. So that for all of the advancement, for all of the, power, military and otherwise, that a nation may have, it may very well find itself unable to cope with certain issues and problems. And I think that's sort of the case here too in the 1970s on a global political scale, but also we'll be talking about economic issues. And we'll be talking about issues of governance, among other things, with Watergate. And then a sort of third element is tied to that, and it is a sense among Americans in the 1970s, many Americans anyway, that perhaps the best days of the U.S. were perhaps come and gone. That the affluence and what many Americans had taken for granted, not necessarily the other America, but, mainstream middle-class sort of Americans had taken for granted, was that the good days, the happy days, to use a phrase, would continue. And perhaps by the 70s, there were some real deep questions about whether that was the case. And that grew out of the sort of failures of the U.S. in Vietnam, I think. The sense that the American economy was struggling in the 1970s, as it hadn't done since before the Second World War, And it always, it reminds me, perhaps the best way to put this would be to borrow some lyrics from Merle Haggard, right? Who sang, "Are the good times really over for good?" There's a lot in those lyrics. It's not just about a personal relationship that's falling apart, but perhaps expressed a certain sense that the good times, the affluence, America as superpower might be in danger. And that's a sensibility that I think works throughout the 1970s as Americans and American leadership, as they struggle and seem unable to deal with major threatening issues, both abroad and at home. And that makes the 70s important. So we're going to spend some time on the 1970s.